Howdy, and welcome to the White Hat Law Show with Warren Nord, where we cover a mix of current events, politics, and the law. Take it away, Warren.
Hi, I'm Warren Nord with Nord Law, and I'm here today to talk about all things Confederate and statues and the big craze that suddenly occurred last summer when suddenly everybody was upset about statues. As I see this, it seems to be a rework of the Civil War where people don't like the way that the Civil War ended with a peace. They want to go back and redo this and kill off all the idea that any of these guys were honorable. But I met Sandra Crenshaw at the celebration or memorial for the General Lee statue, and it was taken down a couple months ago, and I thought she had some interesting things to say. Sandra was on the Dallas City Council for a while and ran for State House.
Yes.
And what have you been doing recently?
Well, I'm really pursuing my avocation. I did get a degree in sociology and history, and I'm getting ready to publish on the 19th of June, the Civil War and Blacks and the Confederates.
And how did you get involved in this issue?
In the particular issue with the Confederates?
Yeah,
or
with the General Lee
Juneteenth?
statue. That seems to...
Well, actually, I served on the Dallas Park Board when this issue came up in the 1990s.
Ah.
I chaired the committee, and it was the first time that we had what we call a 14-1 council, which was single-member districts that was designed to make sure that there were people of all races that were sitting on boards and commissions and on the Dallas City Council, and more accurately reflected our population. And so this was one of the first issues that came forth. Members of the LGBT committee wanted to put up an AIDS memorial there at the Lee Park, and of course those people felt that that wasn't a match for the Southern heritage and the Southern pride that was the theme of that particular park,
right.
And they denied it. And so we came in, the African Americans, and said, well, but what's missing from here is the role that the African Americans played, and we'd like to get some assistance in preserving our history as well. And so you will see at that park in the narrative inside Arlington Hall is a memorial to the African Americans who fought both in the Union and in the Confederate. And so I'm very proud of that move that we took at that time.
Well, tell us about how that memorial got there in 1936. How'd that all come about?
Well, that was the issue of how it got there and what was going on in 1936. One of the things that the protesters couldn't understand is why would you put up a statue of a Confederate general so long after the war was over? They couldn't put that together, and that was one of the problems that I have with the city is that they did not share with them that that was done in the centennial of Texas. It was the 100th anniversary of the state of Texas in 1936, and so Texas was a Confederate state. In fact, there were 6 flags that flew over Texas. And so the women of the Southern Memorial Association decided to erect that statue in memory of those people who had fought in the war.
Well, one of the things I like to do in these kinds of shows is point out some of the mythology. So I hear people say, well, these were all passive-aggressive responses to the civil rights era, and I said, well, it seemed like that was a little bit after that. But that's just nonsense.
I tell you, we have a lot of work to do. It was just painful. It was horrific. I mean, we were just sitting there. There's quite a few African Americans in Dallas who are noted. Some of us travel all over the United States talking about the peculiar history, the rebellious history of Texas, and we share in that pride. I mean, we go, don't mess with Texas. And to see these younger people, many of them who are here from New York and California, who have come to Texas with no ties, and yet they want to lead the charge to take down our history. And so we've got to fight on that. I mean, we should be standing as a beacon, a representative of how we have negotiated. And that's what we did when people came in 1992 wanting to remove the statue or who wanted to change the narrative. We sat down and we talked about it. And this generation just didn't. They make up their own history.
Right, and so that's why we do these shows, to make sure that people get a clue. I've always been fascinated by the end of the Civil War, because that seems to me like where this kind of goes. They just don't like this idea of General Lee leaving the battlefield with his guns. They don't like General Chamberlain of the North saluting the departing soldiers from the South. They don't like this idea that anybody on the South could have been honorable. And that any idea of saying that General Lee should be honored is tantamount to saying we would like to reinstitute slavery. And that's what I kind of see out of these people.
Well, because there's a lot of social engineering going on, and one of the reasons why I'm in this fight to the end, because it seems to be that the honor, the negotiations, the compromises that were made seem to be trying to, well, let's do this way. I think the most horrifying signs that I see in those protests, it says, make white races afraid again. And it seems like the African American is being used to stir up the negative feelings towards slavery. Because when you say to the African American community, God, why are you just picking on the Confederates when the Unions had slaves too? And they said, but the Union, I mean, the South was a traitor to the Union. And I said, okay, if that's true, and we'll talk maybe later about whether or not the South was traitors. But if both sides had slaves and they fought a war and they compromised and they freed the slaves through a compromise, through an amendment, and it took all sides to do that, why are we trying to undo and fight the Civil War all over again? Right. I don't understand that part. 150 years later, I don't understand that part. And I'm a member of the African American Genealogical Society, and I'm telling you, we have been feverishly trying to put together, a narrative that includes the African American contributions. And I find this talk and this miseducation of the community, the African American community, counterproductive to all the things that we have been trying to do. We just opened up last year the African American Smithsonian Museum there in Washington, D.C. to tell our side of the story. And I just don't understand it. Well, I don't understand.
One of my struggles I have with this is it doesn't seem to be any limit to this. When you start saying, okay, if we're going to take away the General Lee statue, I come from Arlington, right? Arlington, Texas, and what is Arlington named for, right? It's named for Lee's home, Lee's estate, and we have JPS, we have the JPS Hospital, John Peter Smith. Who is John Peter Smith? Father of Fort Worth. Well, Confederate Colonel, turns out.
Oh, we can go on and on and on. And that's what made me suspect. Yeah. It made me suspect that you have like the Earl Cabell building downtown. All of the streets.
People don't know who that is.
Earl Cabell's grandfather was a Confederate general. And all of the streets in Dallas, of course, Dallas made of 66 streets, but at that time, all of the streets in Dallas were named after Confederates.
Right.
And so you would have to take down all of downtown. You'd have to take down Harwood. You'd have to take down Lamar Street. You'd have to take down all of these streets. And why can't we just understand that this was a Confederate state? The leaders, the founders, when they voted to leave the Union, they all pledged to the Confederacy, and their loyalty was to the state of Texas.
Right.
And the majority of the people, chose to leave the Union. And so I didn't understand why we couldn't have that same democratic process, okay? If the majority of the people in that neighborhood park said that they wanted to leave the statue there, then why are we allowing people in other neighborhoods come in and say, take it down? You know, it's not like it's sitting in front of the seat of government where, you know, if that was offensive to people and you had to go to City Hall and maybe that invoked memories or negative memories of slavery and times, I could see that a little bit better than I can a neighborhood park.
Right. Well,
most people in the African American community didn't even know the statue was there. Particularly, they didn't know about the ones at Fair Park. They didn't know about the cemetery next to the convention center. So I just kept being suspect. So when it was revealed to the task force committee that most of the streets downtown, Gaston, Lemon, all of those people were Confederates, they had to backpedal and say, oh, whoa. Well, and especially it was talking about $300,000 to change the name of Gaston, and you're talking about 44 streets in the downtown area. Then they said, we'll let those that have a generic name, we'll let those stay. We won't bother those. But we want to take down the statue in Lee Park. So I just kept saying, there's something else going on here.
Right.
It's got to be.
Right. Well, certainly it doesn't seem to have any natural edge of sanity. You know, we're seeing Thomas Jefferson being attacked. You know, of course, Columbus has been attacked for some time. You know, and so and Washington, father of the country. Well, he had slaves, so therefore, you know, out with him. And people say, well, nobody's saying that, but yeah, people are saying that. There are people that are leaders within certain communities are saying, yeah, we have to undo the anthem now. I've heard, you know, recently the California NAACP has said we got to get rid of the anthem because it mentions slaves in it. Of course, it's talking about the British use of mercenaries and slaves during the War of 1812, I think it was. And so, we got to get rid of that. Really?
Well, I think what's left out of our history books, our American history books, is that for centuries and centuries and centuries, white people enslaved white people. Okay?
We're going to ignore that. I can't talk about that. You can talk about that.
I know, but they enslaved, white people. It was only until the Atlantic trade that Africans had fought wars and they were prisoners, but they were not slaves. And so once we understand that was part of the way of the world, I don't think that, and I think we need to do that because you look at other people who have suffered, like the Jews in the Holocaust, and they got together and they pulled themselves up and they remind themselves of the Holocaust, but they get over it.
Right.
The Italians, the other immigrants that have come here, they suffered discrimination and prejudice against them, but they got in here and they rolled their sleeves up and they worked and they got over it. And so it seems to me that slavery is always used to keep the African American with a crutch.
Right.
You know, that's an excuse why we haven't gotten up. Now, there are prejudice.
Sure.
I mean, there is definitely racism. If you define racism as the ability to use power to keep another person down simply because of their race, then yes, that is there. But at the same time, we need to look at the African American. Once slavery was over, they formed freedmen's towns. And they built their own schools, they educated themselves, they took the skills that they learned from being slaves and did them for themselves. And we had thriving communities here in Dallas that are doing better. We have very few Black-owned businesses now.
Right.
But at that time, all of the businesses in the Black community were owned by ourselves. And so we do need to look at seriously at what's the objective of this? I mean, where are we going? And certainly we must get in there and try to resist taking our pride away from us.
We can spend all day on that,
yeah.
I'm sure. But we're going to take a break now.
Really
we'll come
complex.
back with Pat Fallon, state representative, who has some ideas on laws we can change and make things better.
Let's do that.
And we'll be right back.
Hang on, y'all. More with Warren when we get back. Welcome back, folks. You're listening to the White Hat Law Show with Warren Norris. Take it away, Warren.
Joining me now is Representative Pat Fallon. Pat Fallon has been in this Texas State House since 2013. Previously, he was with the Frisco City Council, and in the State House, he represents the eastern half, or eastern third of Denton County. Did I get that right?
Yeah, about an eastern quarter, yeah.
Eastern quarter, something like that. So we brought Representative Fallon on because he's had some ideas in the state legislature on how to resolve some of this controversy. Representative Fallon, can you tell us what got you involved in this issue?
Well, like many people, we became aware of it because it just seemed so absurd to even discuss until the Dallas City Council voted to waste hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars to remove a beautiful piece of artwork in the Robert E. Lee statue down in Dallas Park, named after the general. And I mean, that's a statue that was dedicated by Franklin Roosevelt, not exactly anyone described as a right-winger, back in 1936.
Not a secret Ku Klux Klan guy? Probably not.
Yeah, probably not. And I wouldn't say that. Anyhow, so when I've heard about it, I just couldn't believe it. I was just so disgusted because it's important to know our history, and you can't wipe away the fact that there was a civil war for 4 years in the 1860s, and that 600,000 young men lost their lives fighting for what they believed in. And I think we should remember that. And I think General Lee, on balance, was a good American. If you look at the balance of his life. So why not just leave it there? And when I found out they were going to remove it, and then the cost, I posted on Facebook. And you kind of forget sometimes that you're not only an activist, you are an elected official, so that got a little bit more attention than I thought. And I was glad about that. And then the media started to contact me because apparently there weren't a lot of other lawmakers defending the statues.
Well, I think the cost of that is up to about $700,000 at this point. So you think that Dallas had a better way to spend $700,000?
Well, considering they're in a crisis with their law enforcement and their police and the salaries and retention and even attracting good men and women to be on the Dallas Police, to become a part of the Dallas Police Department, that should be their focus, not these statues. And of course, a lot of liberals, in fact, even some of the media had asked, apologize for the guns today, but they've asked, hey, what do you say to that person that looks upon that statue or that monument and they're offended? And so what I say is, in the course of American history, the 241 years, there's not one documented case of a monument or statue becoming animated and actually harming a human being. So don't worry about it. You'll be safe. It'll be okay.
Yeah, I find that when I've had some opportunities to go to travel, and when I go to the Coliseum, where Christians were killed, those are my people, and I say, well, are we going to tear down the Coliseum? And if we pull on that thread and we start taking down every statue of every imperfect being or anybody who's ever done anything that doesn't meet the sensibilities of this day and time, we're going to have an impoverished culture that's missing out quite a bit.
Well, and it's also, the whole premise is flawed because, again, it's just these false flags of most of these statues were put up in the 50s by people that, thought one race was better than another, and it was done to intimidate our African-American brothers and sisters. No, it wasn't at all. In fact, I found it interesting because I was up in Sherman, Texas, and they have a beautiful monument erected to the Confederacy and really the soldiers that fought for the Confederacy. And I was up in Grayson County in Sherman, Texas. They have a beautiful monument there on the courthouse lawn dedicated to the soldiers of the Confederacy. It was erected, I believe, in 1896. So you do the math on that. It's about 34 years after the Civil War ended. So the people that probably paid for that were in their 50s, 60s. Guess what? They probably fought in that war. And they were erecting it for friends and family members that died in that war. And I read all of the inscriptions, and it was about honoring their valor and the fact that they gave their lives for their cause and for their home. I don't get where that has anything whatsoever to do with anything racial. That's what it was for. At that time in 1896, we were a one-heeled nation. So I think the premise is flawed to begin with.
Well, I certainly agree. We were talking about this a few minutes ago, but there was, in ancient Roman times, there was this, the senators of Rome would pass a damnatio memoriae kind of act that said we're going to erase from all of history some traitor's name, and so there seems to be this idea that we're going to take all the leaders of the Confederacy and erase them and forget that they have any idea or any claim to honor. And it's just a pretty horrific attempt to redo the peace at the end of the Civil War. But you were talking about a bill, I thought.
Yes. So, it was very clear to me that we needed to handle this at the state level because, again, it's another attempt by the left to talk about things and distract us from, issues at the issues at hand. So sometimes we have to do this. We had to pass the Merry Christmas bill in 2013 to codify in Texas law that children, teachers, parents could say Merry Christmas on school grounds, Happy Hanukkah, traditional Christmas greetings, wear Christmas shirts, things of that nature. Because they have these winter parties now. They can legally call them Christmas parties. They just choose not to. And it's the same kind of thing. So what I came up with was, I'm running for the Texas Senate. If I'm elected, the first bill I'm going to file is the Texas Historical Protection Act. And I'll be very clear about the two things that it does. One, it will protect in perpetuity all war monuments on state grounds. Two, any monuments or statues that are on any political subdivisions grounds, the county owns it, the school district owns it, or the city owns it. It's there, so we have to protect property rights, but they are going to be forbidden to spend any tax dollars destroying, defacing, or removing the monuments or statues. Because then Dallas would have had to somehow collect $1 million privately to remove the statue, and I don't think that would have happened.
It seems like a lot of these problems only appear on public property, right? If it's a private property, then you don't have that problem.
Private property, you can do what you want. It's yours.
Right. So I always like that as my go-to solution. We don't have to worry about those things if it belongs to individuals or a private organization. So as you haven't had an opportunity to introduce that bill, right? That's just because we're in session.
Correct.
So
it'll be now. If we have a special session between now and January of 2019, I would introduce it in the House. And if we don't, then if elected, I'll introduce it into the Senate in 2019.
Well, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that it's unfortunate that the legislature has to occasionally kind of raise its hand and say, "Look, people, we're going to pass a common sense bill so that you can say things like Merry Christmas and you can have statues that treat leaders of the nation with honor without having to worry about it being the victim of a legislative fad by city councils." So I appreciate that.
And you know what, Warren, you're right, because don't we elect people to lead? Don't we want our leaders to lead? Tell me what you believe. Don't poll it. Don't check with me. Just tell me, what do you think? What do you believe? And,
yeah.
And a story, instead of just running for the shadows because you're going to be called names. I'm so sick and tired of the left overusing pejoratives, and I don't even like to repeat them because they're just so ridiculous. But because we have to fight them and battle them and say, no, you don't get to get away with things and bully just because you're going to call me, awful names. Because I believe in free markets, I want to throw babies in ovens. I mean, this is how ridiculous it's gotten. Because they don't want to be intellectually honest, and they don't want to debate. They just want to be operate on emotion, and that's not a way in which to really further the political discourse.
Yeah, I've enjoyed recently. Ben Shapiro talks a lot about this. This idea that you walk into a room and you say, "I'm a victim, and I've got a feeling about this, and therefore my feelings trump all common sense and everything else because I've got this feeling," and you can't fight back with that.
It's also rather curious that in the 8 years of the Obama administration, these monuments didn't offend anyone. I mean, nobody was talking about it. Not one iota of chatter, and then suddenly Trump went, and I bet you if Hillary had won, they wouldn't have talked about it. It's clearly an attempt to further divide America.
I agree.
It's cheap, it's fabricated, and it's something that we just have to, in Texas anyway, take care of once and for all and move on down the road.
All right, well, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and have a little roundtable about some of the other issues concerning this. We'll be back in just a minute. We hope you join us.
Whoa, hang on to your hat, folks. More with Warren Nord when we get back. Y'all are back here listening to the White Hat Law Show. Warren, who do we have up next?
Welcome back. In this segment, we're going to talk about the lawsuit that's going on in Dallas right now regarding the General Lee statue and some other issues that are kind of around that. Sandra, tell us what was done wrong in the process to take out the General Lee statue?
Well, in the 80s, the city of Dallas designated all of their monuments and gifts to the city as art. And they did have a clause in there that after 40 years, and they did this basically if it was land that they wanted to use for something else,
Right.
that after 40 years, you could go back and revisit to decommission the art. But that also required a task force of citizens and of 6 at-large individuals with expertise in the arts or sculptures or in parks and recreation, law, and architecture. And what we saw in Dallas was a violation of due process because the city council, in a clause that if there is an emergency, and usually that's if a tree's fallen on the deal and they need to remove the statue for that if it's fallen in the street. They used a clause in there to take down the statue stating that it was in danger of being harmed, and they used emergency funds to finance that. And then the task force chair made it very clear that their duty was to only that the council had already removed the statue. And there were several people who fought and said, no, they just removed it for emergency reasons. She said, no, the decision has already been made. And that's how she redirected the recommendations to come out with the intent was to remove the statues from that particular location.
Right. Well, I think it's important for people to understand that although the statue has been moved, the suit that was filed against the city of Dallas is still going on.
Yes.
Right. So last month, in September, Judge Fitzwater in the federal court denied the TRO, the temporary restraining order, because he said there's no irreparable harm. If you want to have an injunction, you have to show that there's irreparable harm. And usually we talk about the standard example is these guys are getting ready to cut down this 100-year-old tree, and if we allow them to do that, then you can never undo that because you just can't replace a 100-year-old tree. Mm-hmm. And so that's irreparable harm, or somebody's going to be hurt in some way. Well, here, all it takes is money to move the statue and money to bring it back, and so there's no irreparable harm. That's what the court said. Mm-hmm. But the lawsuit on whether to move it or not is still completely ongoing.
The violation of the due process.
The violation, right? And so there's still a lawsuit, and they may have to wind up putting that right back. And it's, I've looked at it, and it looks like a reasonable suit to me, mm-hmm. and it seems to me like they're going to. I would not. I'd say it's a jump ball on the suit, just because of the political purposes. And in the meantime, we have the opportunity to talk about this. Representative Fallon, if we were to pass your law, are you going to give us a private right of action to enforce this law?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think you have to put the teeth behind any legislation that you do pass. And furthermore, to Sanders' point, I thought it was interesting that they used an emergency clause and they removed it for fear it could be harmed. That's like saying, I'm afraid of being murdered, so I'm going to commit suicide. That makes absolutely no sense.
I guess, I could deny them their victory. Yeah, that's a strange way to do it. So,
well, what's really sad is that when the plaintiffs got the first TRO, is because the city was unable to demonstrate to the judge that there was an emergency, that there was threats of harm, and after a lot of criticism, they decided to orchestrate a danger. And it was really sad that Mr. Carraway said from the council, he says, y'all, we were trying to save the statue. We did the right thing because our intelligence told us that someone was going to come there with a tow truck and pull it down. And we go like, well, why do you just didn't have intelligence arrest those people if they, were trying to vandalize it?
I think that a couple of security guards for this period of time would be a lot cheaper than the $500,000 plus that they're spending to move the statue around. And
so then that's why the judge had to lift the original TRO, is because there was a threat that had been manifested, and it's just a charade. And now they're telling the city council, after the judge granted a preliminary injunction for the due process lawsuit to proceed, that they're going to let the city manager look at it, give some time, instead of just being honest with people and said, okay, guys, we jumped the gun. And so we may have to listen to what the citizens have to say now.
Well, I think we're going to see a panoply of suits by various people all over the country, and certainly all over Texas, to make sure that people slow down. And I think if we just slow things down so that this fad goes away, it'll be kind of like the taking a knee at the anthem thing. It kind of ran its course, and now we're just about done with that. You see it a little bit, but it's going away. These things kind of go in fads. If we can just get past the fad, we'll be okay. But we do want the permanent fix in there, Representative.
Well, because you don't want fads come and go, and you don't want it to come back.
Right.
And it's just something that we're just not going to discuss, and we're going to move on down the road. And again, something that I think is very important to talk about here is, what are we going to do at places like Gettysburg? Is it just going to be, I mean, if the left had their way, that there's just going to be the Union shooting at a bunch of air? I mean, this is history. There was a giant major battle in July, of 1863, and it happened in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And for me, and I think for most Americans, if not, darn near all, when I see any, whether it's a Confederate or a Union statue, I think about what happened for those 4 years in the 1860s. I think about the plight of our African-American brothers and sisters for centuries, and how it was resolved once and for all after the Civil War. And we came together and healed as a nation. We were not the greatest nation history had ever known prior to the Civil War, but we became that after. And that's what I see. So I think it's a good and healthy thing for our children to know why it happened, and then moving forward and honoring all those. And weren't there a rather significant amount of African American soldiers even in the Confederacy and as well as the Union? So I just don't see their premise as valid.
Well, we talk about the compromise and why Lee is so revered is because he didn't have to concede. I mean, Texas, for one, didn't want to stop fighting. In fact, we were the last of the battles of the Civil War. We didn't want to stop fighting. We were the last to come back into the Union. And the fact that he conceded and they sat down and compromised, they worked out problems and situations, and those should be the examples that our children need to be taught. And another thing that you need to do in the legislature is to make sure that that our colleges are teaching our children correct history. There were 5 people from universities that told the public that the Confederate statues were put up to intimidate the African Americans. And it was very clear why those statues were erected. They were memorials. They were memorials to people who died. And that's not the American way to, we all of our faiths have a reverence towards memorials. And the other thing that kind of bothered me about this was that all of us, when we die, even the Catholics don't let you eulogize, but when we die, we think about the good things. All of us have baggage and have things that we've done in life that we may be ashamed of. And we think about the good things. And that's on the African American community, too. When we celebrate the 19th of June, we don't want to think about being enslaved. We just want to think about freedom. And that's what this war was fought about, and that's what this country was founded on, was freedom. And that's why we celebrate the 4th of July, is freedom. And we just want to focus on that. We want to move on with this. We want to try to learn to live together with each other. And when we're being taught, when our children are being taught in these schools that the Confederates were bad people and that slavery was bad, and we don't look on, then we're going to continue to have divides in our, it's counterproductive to everything that we're trying to do.
Well, we talked about a little bit we have a fabric in our society, and just like any fabric, if you pull out one thread, it doesn't really damage it that much. But if you start pulling out every thread of every person, again, that doesn't meet today's sensibilities, and doesn't, if we pull out all of those, well, we don't have a lot of our streets get unnamed. We have to redo a lot of society. We have a very poor fabric, as threadbare, as you might say. You lose a lot of your culture. A lot of people go all over the world, look at statues from people long dead that wouldn't make today's cut, but we still honor them.
You know what, Warren? That's a good point, because are we going to rename July and August because they're named after European slaveholders?
I think that's the most extreme example I've heard. Thank you for that. There you go. Well, I want to, Pat, thank you for joining us. Sandra, thank you for joining us.
I wanted to leave us with this last quote about, there's a gentleman who was the past editor of the Dallas Caller, and he said that Texas must either lead this fight or get in line with the other mourners at the funeral. So I want to thank you as a host, and Pat, you stay down there with us and try to get this corrected in the legislature. And don't forget, don't mess with Texas.
There you go.
Absolutely. I think we have a presidential candidate. I'd vote for her.
Well, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on White Hat Law.
Well, that's a wrap, folks, and we want to thank you for listening to the White Hat Law Show here with Warren Norrid. To find out more about Warren, check him out at norridlaw.com. See you next time.